After spending multiple videos breaking down hidden true crimes nearly 4 hour We Respond video, one pattern kept standing out to me. The analysis kept moving outward toward critics, toward Christina, Lauren's alleged stalker, the court, gender bias, moral psychology, free speech, and eventually even Salem. But Lauren's own role in the original conduct, the emails, the fallout among friends, the 9 hour live, and the public response that followed was addressed mostly in passing.
And so people make mistakes. You've made some mistakes here. You've acknowledged that.
And that is the part I couldn't get past. Hi, everyone. My name is Stina. Welcome back to Motive and Method, or welcome if you're new here. My background is in communication, and on this channel, I look at patterns in framing, language, narrative structure, and how information is presented. And before we go further, I want to be clear. This is not about bashing Lauren, or anyone else for that matter. I have compassion for her. I believe she was distressed. I believe she made mistakes, as we all do. None of us are perfect. But compassion and accountability can exist at the same time. We can care about someone's pain and still ask whether the frame being used is accurate. So no, this is not going to be a 4 hour response to a nearly 4 hour response video, because I care about you guys too much to do that to you. So this is a recap. And the question I kept coming back to was simple. Why was everyone analyzed except Lauren? And that is a pattern we're going to keep seeing over and over again throughout their We Respond video.
And before we even get into the opening example, I want to point out that even the title is part of the frame. The price of truth tells the audience before the video begins the truth has already been spoken, and that what follows is the cost of speaking it.
So let's start where the video starts, with a now famous Brad Pitt comparison.
I'm going to start in a fairly peculiar, unexpected place.
Okay.
And I'm going to start with talking about Brad Pitt, the actor.
That is peculiar.
That is, it is a little peculiar, right?
Because yes, apparently that is where we're beginning. John opens by walking through Brad Pitt's body of work, then moves into the allegations involving Angelina Jolie and the question of whether people can separate the work from the person. And I don't think that opening is random, because it plants the frame.
And I think there's something really interesting here that we need to consider that applies to our situation. And this is where this is important. The problem Angelina Jolie had in trying to make this a moral crusade was that Brad Pitt has this body of work.
Can you separate the work from the person? In some cases, that, of course, is a fair question. People make those decisions all the time with actors, musicians, authors, businesses, and creators. But from a communication standpoint, this is where the analogy starts functioning like a false equivalency. A false equivalency works because two things can look similar enough on the surface that the comparison feels reasonable. So the viewer may think, well, yes, I can separate Brad Pitt's acting from his personal life, so maybe I should separate Lauren from hidden true crime in the same way. But once you look at what each thing actually is, the comparison starts to break down. Brad Pitt acting in a movie is not the same thing as a true crime psychology channel analyzing real people, real victims, real families, and real harm. Hidden true crimes work depends on trust. Trust in the judgment, the framing, the ethics, and the lens of the creators. So when the controversy involves private messages, public accusations, and the treatment of a much smaller creator within the same true crime ecosystem, that does not sit outside the work. It reaches into the work. For hidden true crime, trust is not separate from the work. Trust is part of the work. And that is why, for many viewers, This was not simply about refusing to separate Lauren's behavior from the channel. It was about reassessing whether they still trusted the lens. So the Brad Pitt comparison may sound like a question about fairness, but from a framing standpoint, it also does something else. It starts positioning the criticism as moral judgment or cancellation, while Lauren's own role in why viewers started questioning the work stays much less examined. After the Brad Pitt comparison, John moves into psychological essentialism, and this is where Lauren's private messages enter the conversation. But the way they enter is interesting. They are introduced mainly through context, private messages, expectation of privacy, group venting, and the idea that critics reduce Lauren to a fixed label.
So, an example of psychological essentialism is you take one of those messages out of context,
Out of context.
meant to be private. You take one of those messages and then you develop a sticky label.
And to be fair, context does matter. Private conversations are different from public statements, of course. People vent, and there are real ethical questions around privacy, betrayal, and whether private messages should have been shared. But from a communication standpoint, this is where I see a contextualization frame doing a lot of work. It's not that the conduct disappears, it's that the conduct gets surrounded by explanation until the focus shifts away from what happened and toward the circumstances around it. So the question starts to shift from, what did Lauren say and what responsibility does she have for those words? To, why are people using private messages to label Lauren as immoral? Those are not the same question. One looks inward at conduct, the other looks outward at reaction. And this is where Lauren's agency matters. Lauren has a background in broadcast journalism. She knows, or should know, that anything written, recorded, sent, or transmitted can be captured, saved, forwarded, or shared. That may not make it right, but it does make it foreseeable. Most of us learn this lesson the hard way. Don't put something in writing or on a voice recording that you would be terrified to see played back later. So yes, privacy matters, but privacy expectations do not erase adult agency. Later, that situation was brought in front of a large true crime audience during Lauren's 9-hour live stream. That is why context cannot become a substitute for accountability. And this is where I notice what I'd call a missing mirror, or in communication terms, a lack of reflexivity. The same framework being applied to critics and viewers could also be applied to the response itself. But instead, Lauren's messages become less about what she did and more about what other people did with what she did. And that is a shift. Her conduct is surrounded by context, privacy, distress, complexity, good intentions, and mistakes already apologized for, while everyone else's conduct is analyzed through heavier categories. Critics become part of a smear campaign. Christina becomes a threat profile. Public reaction becomes a moral crusade. But Lauren's own choices do not receive that same level of psychological or ethical scrutiny. Not because Lauren should be reduced to one mistake, but because she should not be exempt from the same seriousness being applied everywhere else. So, after Lauren's messages are placed inside the frame of privacy, context, and psychological essentialism, the response starts moving away from the substance of the criticism and toward the people making it. And that shift is very important as well, and that shift matters. A direct accountability response might ask, what are people upset about? What did we handle poorly? What responsibility do we have for how this became public? But instead, the criticism gets filtered through concepts like, moral judgment, confirmation bias, moral crusade, cancellation, and smear campaign thinking. And to be fair, some online criticism does become unfair. People pile on. People run with partial information. People flatten someone into all good or all bad. That happens. But from a communication standpoint, this is where the response begins psychologizing dissent. Instead of asking only, are these concerns accurate, the frame also starts asking, what is wrong with the people reacting this way? That changes the terrain. The phrase moral crusade is especially important because it is not neutral.
They don't understand that to the people in the smear campaign, this is a moral crusade.
It suggests excess, self-righteousness, and people acting from moral superiority instead of discernment. But not every moral objection is a crusade. Not every viewer who walked away was trying to cancel someone. For some viewers, walking away was a values-based response to a trust rupture. And this is where Lauren's agency matters again, because the group messages became part of the public context through the 9-hour live and the discussion that followed. Lauren framed those messages as private material being distorted, weaponized, and used against her. And maybe some of that context is true. But once she brought that dispute to a large true crime audience, the question was no longer only, why are people reacting this way to Lauren? The question also became, what did Lauren choose to show, emphasize, frame, or leave out? This is the agency piece. Because if the audience is being asked to judge the reaction, they also need enough clarity to judge what people were reacting to. And that is the question that keeps getting less oxygen. So yes, some critics may have been unfair, but when the response spends so much energy analyzing the psychology of the critics, the focus moves away from the choices that triggered the criticism in the first place. And that is where it starts to feel less like reflection and more like containment. After the critics are placed inside a moral and psychological frame, the response moves again. This time, Christina becomes the center of the threat narrative. The question is no longer only, why did viewers start questioning Lauren? It becomes, how dangerous is Christina, and how should her behavior be understood? That shift is essential to understand this entire thing, because Christina is no longer discussed only as someone who may have crossed lines, reacted badly, or participated in public conflict. Her behavior starts moving through much heavier categories: obsession, antisocial traits, sadistic qualities, risk factors, escalation, stalking, and cyberstalking. That kind of language does not just describe behavior, it starts building a profile. And from a communication standpoint, this is a threat framing move. Once someone is framed as a threat, even messy or unclear behavior can start to look like evidence. The action itself hasn't changed, but the lens has. That is why the mic drop moment stood out to me.
On the day of our hearing in September, she went outside, she filmed herself doing a mic drop.
That moment is framed as haunting, harassment, or part of a broader antagonistic pattern. And look, a mic drop outside a courthouse is not exactly a quiet, reflective, let's all process this maturely moment. But there is another way to read it. If someone had publicly accused me of stalking, framed me as dangerous, and I had traveled to an event I paid for, only to be banned after arriving, I'm not sure I would respond with perfect courtroom grace either. In fact, I know I wouldn't. Honestly, I might have had a one-finger salute. Well, you could picture it. Would that be mature? No. But would it be human? Probably. That is the point. Under one frame, the mic drop becomes taunting or harassment. Under another, it could be defiance after humiliation. That does not make it wise, but it may make it understandable. And this is where Lauren's agency matters again. Because once Christina becomes the threat center, Lauren's role in amplifying that threat narrative moves farther into the background. The response does not have to linger as long on Lauren's choices in the 9-hour live, how the audience was activated, or how the situation was framed publicly. Instead, the viewer is guided to focus on Christina as the danger. And that is how accountability quietly relocates. When one person is positioned as the threat, the person who amplified that threat narrative can start to look less like an active participant in the escalation and more like someone simply responding to danger. Once Christina is placed inside the threat frame, the response moves into risk factors, stalking language, cyber stalking criteria, and motive. And this is where the argument starts to feel more clinical. That matters because clinical language changes how the audience hears the story. If you hear she kept contacting someone, you may think of conflict, poor boundaries, anger, or desperation. But if that same behavior is placed under risk factors, escalation, fixation, control, or cyber stalking, it starts to feel like part of a recognized threat pattern. That does not mean those concepts are fake. It means they have to fit the conduct. From a communication standpoint, this is what I call research as authority framing. The research gives the argument weight. It creates the feeling that a category has been established, but the presence of research does not automatically prove the research applies. And one example that stood out to me was when John referenced a source about adolescence, digital communication, cyber victimization, and lurking.
I'm going to frame this by saying, admittedly, this is pertaining to adolescence, okay? But I'm sure this has application to adults.
I was shocked when he said that because maybe some of what in that resource that he checked, and it was a scientific study, it was a validated study apparently. And so maybe some of that does pertain to adults as well. But that transfer has to be argued carefully. Adolescents and adults are not the same population. Their development, social context, and online behavior are not automatically interchangeable. So the question is not just, is this research interesting? The question is, does this actually fit? Because if the fit is loose, research can start functioning less like evidence and more like atmosphere. It creates a feeling of authority around the claim without necessarily proving the claim. And this is where Lauren's agency can move even further into the background. Because once the audience is focused on risk factors, cyberstalking, escalation, and victimization research, the emotional temperature changes. The question becomes, does Christina fit this profile? Instead of, how did Lauren's choices help create or escalate the public situation being analyzed? That is the accountability question that still has to stay visible. Because if the conduct supports the label, the evidence should be able to carry it. And if the conduct is more ambiguous, then the label has to remain open to question. This next section, the court and gender bias, is one I want to handle carefully because there is a real issue underneath it. Women are dismissed. Stalking can be minimized. Female perpetrated stalking may not be taken seriously. And woman-on-woman conflict can get reduced to drama or a catfight. That is real. But from a communication standpoint, a real cultural pattern still has to be connected carefully to the specific case being discussed. Because this is where I think the gender bias frame starts doing a lot of work. If the court outcome did not fully validate the stalking claim, one question could be, what distinction was the court making? Was the court minimizing fear because this involved two women? Or Was the court drawing a line between online conflict, emotional distress, defamation, harassment, and stalking? Those are different possibilities. And that distinction is important because once the gender bias frame enters the argument, skepticism toward the stalking claim can start to look like sexism. Questioning the category can start to look like minimizing women's fear. And asking whether the conduct fits the label can start to sound like refusing to believe a victim. That is a powerful frame, but it cannot answer the conduct question by itself. Bias can distort how conduct is interpreted, but it cannot replace the conduct analysis. And this is where Lauren's agency matters again. Because once the focus becomes Lauren wasn't believed, the response can move past the harder questions. What Lauren showed, what she left out, how she described Christina, and how that shaped the audience's reaction. But the conduct still has to stay visible. What was actually shown, and does it fit the stalking label? Real systemic issues can help clarify what happened, but they can also make a disputed label harder to question. And here, I think the gender bias frame risks becoming that kind of shield. This is where the response moves from category into impact. And impact is essential here. Impact matters. If someone experiences anxiety, fear, humiliation, depression, isolation, or self-harm ideation because of something happening online, that is serious. I am not at all minimizing that. But impact and category are not the same thing. Impact tells us someone was harmed. It does not automatically tell us whether the conduct was criticism, defamation, harassment, cyberbullying, or stalking. That is where I think the response starts to blur the line. The question quietly shifts from, did the conduct meet the standard for stalking, to, look how badly this harmed Lauren. And those are not the same question. Someone can be genuinely harmed, and we can still ask what caused the harm, what category the conduct fits, and whether the evidence supports the label being used. That is not dismissing the harm. It is keeping the analysis clear. From a communication standpoint, this is what I'd call category substitution. When the emotional impact begins to stand in for proof of the category. And I think that also shows up in the thought experiment. John presents a hypothetical where someone is repeatedly accused, followed through major life stages, and harmed in her reputation, work, marriage, and ability to live normally. And this all happened online. To me, it seemed designed to echo what Lauren experienced, even though it was presented as a hypothetical. That lands emotionally. Of course it does. But a thought experiment can clarify an issue, or it can stack the deck. If the hypothetical gives the audience a cleaner, more extreme version of the facts, the audience may accept the emotional conclusion before asking whether the real conduct actually matches. That is the substitution problem, and this is where Lauren's agency moves farther into the background. The focus becomes the harm Lauren experienced, while less time is spent on how the story became public, how the 9-hour life shaped the audience's perception, or what responsibility comes with presenting someone as a threat to a large, highly invested true crime audience. Because if we are analyzing harm, we also have to analyze scale. Christina may have had an online presence, but hidden true crime had the larger platform, the stronger audience loyalty, and the true crime ecosystem reach. That matters. It does not erase Lauren's distress, but it keeps the analysis balanced. By this point, the viewer is carrying Lauren's distress, the worst-case hypothetical, the stalking research, and the moral weight of public destruction all at once. So the category can begin to feel obvious. But feeling obvious is not the same as being established. And that is the distinction I want to hold on to before we move into the final escalation point. Salem. By the end of We Respond, John reaches for one of the most emotionally loaded comparisons in American history, the Salem witch trials. And I'll be honest, this is one of those moments that shocked me into temporary mental silence. Because by this point, we have already moved through psychology, private messages, critics, risk factors, stalking language, cyber stalking, gender bias, a victim impact, and a catastrophic thought experiment. And then we land in Salem. That is not a small rhetorical move. From a communication standpoint, this is analogy escalation. When the comparison becomes more emotionally powerful than the conduct being analyzed. Salem brings in hysteria, false accusations, mob persecution, moral panic, and innocent people being destroyed by a community that believes it is righteous. So, when Salem enters the frame, the emotional meaning of the whole argument changes. The viewer is no longer just being asked, did criticism cross a line? Did the conduct fit the category? Was this stalking? The viewer is being invited to ask, is this a witch hunt? And that is a very different question, because if critics become modern witch hunters, criticism starts to look like persecution. If public reaction becomes Salem, skepticism starts to look dangerous. And if Lauren is placed in the role of the falsely accused, the audience is moved into a moral position before the conduct question has been fully resolved. That is why this comparison matters. Powerful is not the same as precise, and with a topic this serious, precision matters. If the conduct supports the category, the evidence should be able to carry the argument without Salem doing the emotional lifting. But if the comparison is needed to make the audience feel the category, then we have to ask whether the frame is starting to replace the facts. And that is the issue I keep coming back to. The more emotionally powerful the frame becomes, the more important it is to return to the grounded questions. What happened? What was shown? What was alleged? What was proven? And does the conduct match the label? Because if the audience stops asking those questions, the framing has already done its job. So, when I step back from the full response, this is a larger pattern I see. This frame keeps getting bigger. Psychology, morality, critics, risk factors, stalking language, gender bias, victim impact, free speech, a thought experiment, and finally, the Salem witch trials. But the part that still feels underdeveloped is Lauren's own agency. That is what I mean by the missing center. Lauren is not absent from the video. Her distress is central. Her work is defended. Her messages are contextualized. Her pain matters inside the argument. But her choices are not examined with the same seriousness. And that matters because Lauren did not only experience the situation privately. She brought it to a large true crime audience in a 9-hour live. She framed Christina as dangerous. She presented her interpretation to a community already emotionally invested in her and in hidden true crime. At that point, this was no longer just a private conflict. It became a public narrative. And when someone with a large platform tells a story about a lower profile person inside a true crime ecosystem, that comes with responsibility. So the questions cannot only be, how did this hurt Lauren? They also have to be, how did Lauren's public framing affect Christina? How did the 9-hour live shape what viewers believed? Were the categories being used carefully? Did the evidence support the label? Those are not unfair questions. They are the questions that have to be asked if the response is going to ask so many serious questions about everyone else. So, I'll leave you with a question I kept asking throughout this breakdown. When the frame gets this big, what happens to the actual conduct? Does the frame clarify it, or does it start to replace it? That is where I land. with a concern about structure and how authority, psychology, harm, and moral language can move responsibility outward while making that shift feel reasonable. So, I'd really like to know what you think. Did you see the same pattern? Was there a different part of the We Respond video that stood out to you? Was there a moment where you felt the frame shift? Let me know in the comments. I do read them, and the comments on these videos have been some of the most thoughtful parts of this whole discussion. And if you're here because you're trying to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface, that is what this channel is for. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.